have basically three presidents that we can reference by only their initials. The first is FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The second is JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And the last is LBJ, or Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson became a follower of FDR and his style of politics and government early on. He was very good at forging compromises, and that was seen when he helped pass the Civil Rights Act of 1957. That was the first civil rights legislation that had been passed since Reconstruction in the 1800s. Johnson had a very big job ahead of him. He had to try to encourage the nation to move past Kennedy's assassination. He actually does a great job at trying to use what Kennedy would have wanted to get Congress to fall in line and to follow through. His agenda was going to include large tax reductions. It also included civil rights legislation. He gets pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination in public places. This is also one of the first pieces of civil rights legislation that specifically included women. He declared what was called an unconditional war on poverty in his 1964 State of the Union address. In this address, he's going to outline several programs. The first is Head Start. Head Start is a program that's still around today, and it calls for assisting children from low-income families with health services, nutrition services, and parent involvement services. It's going to help them get early education. Job Corps helps those who need it to help find jobs. And VISTA is going to follow along with JFK's insistence and encouragement into getting Americans to volunteer for their country. VISTA stands for Volunteers in Service to America. In the election of 1964, Johnson was running against Republican Barry Goldwater. He is able to win this election by painting Barry Goldwater as an extremist, someone who would be very willing to use that nuclear weapon. And remember how very close we had just been to nuclear war just a few years earlier. Rather than being a very close election like Kennedy had in 1960, this election was a complete landslide. Johnson won 44 out of 50 states. This is going to give him a voter's mandate, something JFK did not have. Johnson can now go to Congress and get pushed through the legislation he wants. His legislative program, or domestic policy, was called the Great Society, and it included his war on poverty. Since he had that voter's mandate from that 1964 election, he had a much easier time getting his measures passed through Congress. He hoped to create a higher standard of living and also provide everyone with equal opportunity. These were major goals that he is going to push through with his more than 60 programs that he got passed. If you look at these Great Society programs, they fall under three main categories: education, housing, or healthcare. Some of the major ones are going to include the Secondary Education Act, which provided aid to public education; Medicare, which provided medical benefits that would become available to everyone over the age of 65. Medicaid was just like Medicare, except this is going to provide it for low-income families who couldn't afford it. So this is all ages. I remember these two by saying Medicare, you care for the elderly. You provide aid to everyone. The HUD, or the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. This developed and executed policy on housing in cities in an attempt to help build up our inner cities again. The National Endowment for the Humanities was created to try to support the humanities, subjects like English, literature, art, social sciences, in opposition to math and science, since we had had such a push for math and science ever since the Cold War began and the launch of Sputnik. We also see a big rise in both government's protection over its consumers. The Immigration Act of 1965 was created to end the National Origins Act, which set up a quota system. This new policy was based on reuniting immigrant families and trying to attract skilled labor to the United States. The Department of Transportation was created, and in 1967, they began to match funds to cities and states for the amount of money that they spent on their roads. We also began to see the environmental movement pick up steam. Rachel Carson writes a book called Silent Spring. In this book, she talks about pesticides and pollution and the dangers that they present to our environment. The book gets its name, Silent Spring, because there was a particular pesticide that was being used that caused the egg shells of eagles to be very thin. And when the bird would sit on its eggs, the egg shells would crack, and then there would be no baby birds born. And Rachel Carson said, if we're not careful, we will have a silent spring. This will lead directly to the Water Quality and Clean Air Act. We also see various consumer protections. Ralph Nader, who you may still hear his name in the news from time to time, was responsible for getting pushed through the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966. He is going to encourage all vehicles to have a seatbelt. During this time, that was certainly not standard. In fact, almost no one used a seatbelt. He recognized the importance and how it could be life-saving in many instances. The Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. This required all companies to identify the manufacturer, give an address of the manufacturer, the quantity and servings contained in all of these products. Again, all designed to protect the consumer. The Warren Court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, is going to lead the Supreme Court on what we call an activist stance. An activist stance is where the court would begin to interpret rights in such a way, in a much broader fashion when you look at the Constitution, and in such a way that it would actually change laws in some cases. This is called an activist stance. Some of these cases were very important. Brown versus Board of Education, ruled on in 1954. This court case outlawed segregation. Mapp versus Ohio determines that any evidence obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment must be excluded from criminal prosecutions, meaning that you have to have a search warrant if you are going to look for evidence, and it must be a specific search warrant. Gideon versus Wainwright will provide lawyers in all criminal cases if the defendant cannot afford one. And finally, Miranda versus Arizona. This is going to establish what we now know as the Miranda rights. Criminal suspects must be informed of their right to consult with an attorney and of their right against self-incrimination before they can be questioned by police. Again, these are called your Miranda rights. When you look at the totality of the Great Society, it really had a big impact. First of all, anytime we see the creation of government programs, we see the extension of federal power. The size and power of the federal government will increase just for the fact that they have to provide for all of these new programs. They did work. The rate of poverty did decrease. So some of these programs that Johnson created accomplished what they set out to achieve. Unfortunately, these programs are not free, and they must be paid for some way. So we begin to see a big budget deficit created. Because of the size and the power of the federal government growing and the fact that our budget deficit was growing as well, you see many conservatives begin to speak out against these Great Society programs. Once the United States becomes heavily involved in Vietnam, we had to make a very hard choice. The choice between what is called guns or butter. Guns represents the war effort and everything that it takes to successfully wage a war, or butter, which are your domestic programs, and in this case, all of these Great Society programs that had helped so many Americans. In this case, the United States had to choose the Vietnam War. You cannot partially fund a war and be successful in that war. So in the choice between guns or butter, the United States chose the guns. This is going to cause also many Americans to even further criticize the conflict in Vietnam and the U.S. involvement there.